مردم شریف ایران، من شهریار افشار هستم، میزبان شما در برنامه پالیتیکس 365. امروز خانم انی فورسهایمر به برنامه ما پیوسته. ایشون یه دیپلمات سابق آمریکا بوده و صاحب نظر در مورد روابط با افغانستان، حقوق بشر، حقوق زنان، و ما امروز میخواستیم ایشون رو دعوت کنیم به برنامه که به ما کمک کنن واقعا در مورد دیپلماسی و ابزار دیپلماسی، the tools of diplomacy سر دنیا، مخصوصا به خاورمیانه و موضوع و مورد به روابط با یک کشوری مثل افغانستان. بقیه برنامه به انگلیسی تهیه شده. Annie Forsheimer, welcome to Politics 365. Thanks so much for joining us. We really want to learn from your experience as a former diplomat, analyst, subject matter expert on the tools of diplomacy, dealing with Afghanistan and really the impacts, human rights issues, women's rights issues worldwide. There's so much to cover. And of course, a lot of this stuff, we could easily be talking about Iran, Afghanistan. They're all kind of, I want to say, generic or global issues that we want to help educate not only the Iranian community, but the American community listening to our conversation. So a little bit, if you could start with your background, your career journey, and then we'll get into the tools.
Thank you so much for having me. My background is a former career diplomat, professional diplomat. I joined the U.S. State Department when I was 24, and I worked for 30 years before retiring about 5 years ago. And I served in 6 countries, but 7 postings. I was in Afghanistan twice, and I served in Latin America, in South Africa, and Turkey. And back in Washington, I worked on policies on security and human rights and peacekeeping. So my journey includes the time I spent since leaving the government. At that point, I began writing about the need for a continued and principled engagement in Afghanistan. And I strongly criticized the US decision to depart in 2021. And I continue to advocate for principled response to the atrocities that are underway by the Taliban.
Right. Thank you so much. I have to really share your concern with the debacle that was the U.S. withdrawal, loss of life. It was just a disaster. And after all that, I understand the political decision of ending America's longest war, but it just created a power vacuum clearly for the Taliban. All the work that was done to build up institutions and support Afghanistan standing on its own fragile 2 feet into what it is now. And now here we are, a Taliban stronghold, God knows what other terrorism stronghold, not only in the Middle East, but on the border of Iran, and God knows what other security issues could emanate from that. And certainly the Taliban is no government that you could take seriously on any world stage. But here they are, quickly just swooped in as soon as the US left, sadly, with the loss of life that was encountered. So unnecessary, it seemed like. Definitely a big black eye for the Biden administration, even though they said they were simply implementing Trump's. You just have to look at that stuff with a great deal of skepticism as to how those things. So I would love to hear your perspective of what the logic was for that withdrawal, and then we'll get into the other topics.
Sure. As you say, you have to be very skeptical of the concept that the Biden administration was somehow bound by the agreement reached under the Trump administration. They felt perfectly free to reverse a lot of other decisions from the Trump administration. So there was a lot of leeway in the agreement. And the agreement, frankly, was signed, if you look at it, the one that was signed in Doha in 2020 was signed between the United States and an entity which didn't even actually have an agreed upon name. It was a flimsy agreement. It did not need to be complied with. And the Taliban, of course, had continued to harbor Al-Qaeda and other terrorists. So they weren't even living up to their side of this agreement. So the US had choices, they made the wrong one. And in February of 2021, a year-long study group came out with a report which strongly advised the Biden administration to keep a small troop presence there, augmented by NATO forces. And instead, what we see is a power vacuum beyond all of the human rights disasters that are happening to Afghans every single day. I mean, the loss of life continues. Is the establishment of dozens, literally, of terrorist groups which are able to exist within Afghanistan without being controlled in any way.
So sad. It's just so difficult to watch after so much, I mean, what, billions of dollars in American taxpayer funding. And then, so I think you sadly confirmed what I feared the most, which was it was a flimsy agreement. The Biden administration could have easily sidestepped it, and it was unnecessary. But I think Biden really wanted to make a good on a political promise or election campaign promise, and hastily removing U.S. troops, causing that those horrible scenes of life, and then it sounds like abandoning U.S. Interpreters and allies and Afghans that have helped the
Yeah.
Americans for all those years. Just
Yeah.
unbelievable. Diplomatic disaster is what I would call it. I don't know.
I would agree,
Yeah.
and I believe that it had as strong as political angle as you say, and it hasn't even paid off politically.
No.
I think that this was about the terminology of what we were doing there. And if you call it a war, you create expectations, but I don't think that we should have been calling it a war. Past 2015, American troops were not involved in the daily fighting that was going on. Afghan troops were doing so. Americans were not suffering major casualties. The year that I served there, 2017 to 18, we had fewer than 24 American forces die. And that is pretty, close to what you lose in traffic accidents on a major base. So we were telling the American people one story, and under that logic, then withdrawals seemed to make sense. But we needed to tell them a different story, which is, here is a part of the world that matters. Here is a minimal footprint with which we can maintain a base in the middle of Asia, where we have no base, between the Middle East and the Philippines. Basically, we have nothing. And we had a base which we gave up. We could tell Americans another story about a generation of Afghans who were coming into power, who were smart and much, much, much less prone to corruption, and who included women and traditionally marginalized groups, and who were so ready to take over from the generation that was still in power in 2021. We were 10 years away probably from them being the ones that we would deal with. And I know these people, and they are amazing. And now they are scattered and somewhat powerless to speak on behalf of the country.
It is sad. I mean, in some respects, obviously, Iranians could be listening to this story and they harken back to their life pre-1979 and how good they had it, and then look to the regime's control, autocratic control of Iran, and feel like we've been set back 1,000 years from what we were. Looking back at not only what Afghanistan and Middle East, Iran, help us understand a little bit more about the U.S. policy choices, the tools of diplomacy that is available. Because, as you say, the Taliban is not necessarily a coherent government or a regime that you can have a cordial and constructive diplomatic relationship with. We certainly don't have a diplomatic relationship with Iran. There are some other autocratic countries around the world that. So I'm always curious when I talk to former diplomats, who are free now to speak about the tools of diplomacy. What do you do with an autocratic regime? Do you engage? Do you isolate? Do sanctions work? And how do you further U.S. foreign policy with a regime that you really is so isolated, like either the Taliban or even the Islamic Republic?
So, while I can talk about tools of diplomacy across the board, and as part of my current life, I'm an academic, so I do this, looking at them objectively, there are certain tools that you do apply on a worldwide basis. And at the same time, it's very difficult to have effective comparisons between countries. One of the special factors about Afghanistan in its landlocked and extremely mountainous terrain is that it is relatively easy for an autocratic regime in Afghanistan to cut off its people from the world. There's actually some talk right now that was called to attention by the Committee to Protect Journalists that the Taliban are considering cutting off access to Facebook. So they have tools that many other countries do not have, and their control of people's lives, particularly women's lives, is so complete that I think that what we do with them would be different than what we would do with another regime, which is also autocratic, but does have pockets of the ability of people within the country to speak for themselves. It's the gold standard that in foreign policy, you want to have relations with a government that truly reflects the will of the people. It is not easy as, a foreign government to say, I don't want to deal with you, the government, I want to deal with this group because they are more legitimate, because then we need metrics of legitimacy. So it's a difficult road to follow. In the case of Afghanistan, I'm a strong advocate that there should be no diplomatic relations and no recognition of the Taliban as anything other than a regime which has physical control of the people. And I think that they should be opposed in every single fora where they want to achieve legitimacy. I advocate nonviolent resistance. I think that while some people really strongly advocate a military response, that is not my personal point of view. But I think that the resistance to the Taliban should be total in terms of cutting off its access to legitimacy and also its access as a regime to some of the financial assistance that might normally accrue to a country that's going through such a difficult economic time, which of course Afghanistan is.
Do you find that that view is shared by the global community? Are there countries that want to engage the Taliban, and is the U.S. An outlier, or is this a global view?
Well, unfortunately, I think over time you see a change from what had been a pretty united global view in 2021 towards where we are today, where some countries have de facto relations. China and Japan and a couple other countries have ambassadors in Afghanistan. They sort of make a shade of distinction that they haven't quite formally recognized the government, but they really, in effect, are doing so. Russia has gone back and forth. Some Central Asian countries are working more closely with the Taliban, honestly, because their economic survival partly depends on it. However, there's a really sizable number of countries that do not and will not at any point in the foreseeable future have relations with the Taliban. And those are the bilateral, right, country to country relations. There's a separate issue about Taliban being recognized in order to achieve, to gain Afghanistan's seat at the United Nations, right? So Afghanistan, the country, never lost its seat. It's still a member. But the Taliban as a regime are trying to represent the country. And so far, the UN's Credentials Committee, which is comprised of member states, including the US and China, has said no.
Wow.
So they're in limbo. And they do not have a government in exile, as some countries in this situation might, but they do have a number of diplomats who were in those seats when the government fell, and they haven't left those seats. And so they are allowed to do certain limited things to still represent the country.
And they're alive. These people that were in those seats and that remained.
They're alive. Yes, they're in New York or Geneva or a
Right.
couple of places in the world. Little by little, though, the Taliban has been pushing some of those the former government's diplomats out of embassies. India really, I think, just almost almost surprisingly has given in, and the Taliban are controlling that embassy. The United Arab Emirates, in other countries, in Iran as well, the Taliban have appointed an ambassador. So these are all these smallish distinctions of the diplomatic tool of recognition. But the
Wow.
big prize, I think, that they're after would be recognition by the West and also the seat at the United Nations. And I'll just say that if they achieved that, we would all, as a world, really suffer. Because if you could imagine the representative of the Taliban standing at that podium during the UN General Assembly and speaking, of how the oppression of women, and that is what you just need to stick to your principle, and you will have a country too. I find that to be so terrifying and so wrong. So I hope that we continue to stick to certain principles of non-recognition until and unless there is a significant change in the human rights atrocities that are ongoing right now.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite a scene, seeing the Taliban come into the UN and begin to spew their rhetoric, given the atrocities that they've committed over the past few decades, really. And as you're speaking, of course, I'm looking at it from an Iranian filter, and what you said. There's a lot of people in the Iranian diaspora that look at the Iranian regime the same way. It's a regime that shouldn't be recognized. But you mentioned China and other countries that have this uneasy alliance where they've recognized the Taliban for their own economic interests. It seems like some countries choose to keep their good relations or cordial relations with the U.S., but also recognize a regime that the U.S. is totally opposed with. And I guess, how do you see the international community evolving? I mean, I understand your point of view, but what does Afghanistan export? What economic value does it have as a country, other than opium and oppression? I mean, what does it export?
Well, let me go back to a couple of the things you said. As a diplomat, I really do need to, also mention the recognition isn't really a prize that you give people because you like them. Think of the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union recognized each other. It doesn't mean you're friends. So that's pretty fundamental. And so in cases around the world, terrible regimes who took power the same way the Taliban did, they're recognized. And I cannot deny that to be true. I don't think it should happen in this case. I really do not. But it is possible. It could happen. Why would they do it? there is economic interest, there's also security interest. Looking at China's point of view, they worry that there are separatists who live in Afghanistan, and the Chinese would like to make sure that those groups are controlled. And so they think of engagement, if not full recognition, as a way of ensuring their own security interests. Economically, Afghanistan has natural resources, particularly in some energy resources. Minerals is the biggest one that people will mention, both precious minerals and also rare earth minerals, so lithium, etc. And as you know, right, with a brand new market for all of those. China has entered into a number of contracts for these minerals. There's one way of looking at it, which is not that China wants to extract the minerals. They really just want to make sure nobody else does. Because they have the same ones, right? China and Afghanistan are neighbors, so the minerals are there underneath both countries. But if Afghanistan's minerals are getting out into the world, then the prices will go down and China will not have as much of its own, the cornering the market idea. Finally, I'll just mention, though, that the recognition question is one of the reasons why the campaign to term what is happening in Afghanistan gender apartheid is such an important campaign. The only government that's been kicked out of the General Assembly for being a very bad government is South Africa in 1974. And so it is really vital to the cause of non-recognition of the Taliban that people understand that this is exactly the same thing. What they are doing is the same thing that got South Africa kicked out of the United Nations. So let's just not allow them in, skip a step. It's just really, really important that this recognition be codified, and that people use the term gender apartheid when referring to what the Taliban is doing.
Wow, thank you so much for that explanation. China seems to step in wherever the U.S. backs out, and they've invested a lot in Iran. They have a lot of motives to their self-interest, and with that financial forum that they've also created with India and others. And the gender apartheid issue, really, I'm glad you pointed that and finished with that, because that's really one of the most important things facing a civilized society, as we like to, call ourselves. We can't really ignore that. We see so much atrocities going on in countries like Afghanistan. We have to keep this conversation alive, keep talking about it, writing about it, speaking about it, and not legitimizing it by, like you say, allowing the Afghanistan, the Taliban, get back into the civilized society. And Pforzheimer, thank you so much for joining us. I learned a lot. Thank you so much. Such a fascinating topic. I feel like I was in class again, listening to a lecture. But please come back and join us more, because this topic will not end. Afghanistan, one of Iran's most critical neighbors, good or bad. We share a border, and as they say, Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. So many empires have come and gone, and Afghanistan and the hasty withdrawal of American troops have undermined the peace-loving people of Afghanistan, who deserve much, much better, just like the people of Iran next door. So thanks so much for that explanation. We learned a lot.
Thank you.